Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be doing my second part to the Place and Time book tag. This is a tag that was originally created by Jen Campbell and I will leave her video linked down below in the description, as well as the lovely Charlotte who tagged me to do this video. In my part 1 of this video, which I will also leave linked down below, I spoke about the fiction and the poetry, and in this video I'm just going to be talking about non-fiction. Basically the premise of this tag is that you discuss books that you associate with a particular time or place in your life. And there were so many books that I wanted to talk about that I knew I had to do 2 parts to this video. What I noticed across both sets of books that I'm discussing is that they are often books that came to me when I was in quite an in-between stage, either physically or kind of just in like the broad scope of my life. So books that I read in quite liminal spaces, like being on transport, being in airports, being in hotel rooms, or books that I read when I was in kind of like in-between stages of my life. I'm going to talk about these books in the order I read them in because I think these books kind of match up with the chronology of my life. First, I'm going to talk about Girl Up by Laura Bates. I've actually told the story of me reading this book quite a few times, but I love my connection to this book. As came up in the first part of this tag, a few of these books are books that I really associate with breakups, and I have done a full video on breakup books, which I will leave linked down below in the description as well. But I just really so strongly remember reading this book. So I read this book on a really long coach journey from Aberystwyth, where I went to university, to London, and I was going to a friend's 21st birthday party. I just had a really massive breakup, and the relationship that I got out of was a very toxic one, where he was very controlling about what I was like allowed to do, and I just wouldn't have been able to go to this friend of mine's birthday party. Like it just wouldn't have happened if I was in that relationship still. I bought this book the day of the breakup before it happened, and then I read it on this coach journey, doing this like empowering thing that I wouldn't have been able to do when I was in that relationship. And the premise of this book is really about, I guess, teaching young girls, like teenage girls, about respecting their own bodies, telling them that no one is entitled to their body without their permission, about loving their bodies and being comfortable with their bodies. And there are dancing vulvas on the end papers, and there's just amazing illustrations throughout this book. And even though a lot of it felt like feminism and empowerment 101, it was something that I felt like I really needed a reminder of in that time of my life. And I think a lot of the books that I really connect to with particular times and places are books that I read in one sitting as well, and that's definitely the experience I had with this one. I think I'll just always feel really connected to this book because of that experience. Next is a bit of a weird one. So this is Love and Sex with Robots by David Levy. This is a book that looks at kind of like the history of sex toys, but leading up to like AI and sex robots, which is something that I'm really interested in learning about and have really complicated, unresolved thoughts on. If I'm remembering this book correctly, there was definitely some stuff in here that I really disagreed with, but I definitely got a lot out of it. The reason I read this was because I was doing a writing sci-fi and fantasy module at university, and I'm not a big sci-fi or fantasy reader, but I am interested in the kind of like Black Mirror side of sci-fi, and I was really interested in like sex technology, and that's what I did my assignment on. I did a short story about if sex robots became more commonplace, and this was just a really fantastic resource for me, even if I didn't agree with everything that was in the book. And I really remember it because of like that particular assignment and reading it at university. I was also in the middle of reading this book when I started dating my second boyfriend, and I think it was just a bit of an interesting introduction to me as a person when he was like, hey, what are you reading? And I was like, this book about sex robots. I just didn't think there was really going to be another opportunity for me to talk about this book, so here you go. We're gonna skip forward like over a year in the chronology of my life to when that boyfriend dumped me. This is actually a story that I'd forgotten happened until yesterday. I'm not gonna go into the full details of the story because it's probably not that interesting for you, and also like I don't necessarily want to tell it. But basically after that breakup I was in like the worst mental health space I had ever been in my whole life. And I was due to travel back to Derby, where I had moved to do my masters, back from Aberystwyth, and I missed my coach. I was not in a good state at all, like not good. Like thinking back on it, I'm like very embarrassed about the state I was in, but this lovely older couple came over to me and they just sorted me the fuck out. They like paid for me to get a train to Birmingham, which if you know anything about Aberystwyth, Birmingham is the only place you can get to. And they were like, if you get to Birmingham, are you gonna be okay? Like, will you be able to get home from there? And I was like, yeah. And like, they just paid for my train ticket. They didn't let me argue or anything. And they also gave me a tenner to get tea and snacks on the train. And I was just like sobbing, and like, not only was them kind of like paying for my train ticket a huge burden off me who like didn't have any fucking money, but it was the fact that they just kind of took charge of the situation for me, and they were like, we'll get you home, don't worry. And honestly, I well up just thinking about it. But anyway, the book. The book that I really associate with this experience is The Life-Changing Magic of Not Giving a Fuck by Sarah Knight. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Sarah Knight's books, but I didn't have any physical books with me, which is how you know that like my mental health was in the fucking gutter. But I had this book on my Kindle, and I just decided, okay, I need something to read on this train journey. I need to get my mind off it. This feels like it will be empowering. I don't think it was actually a book that I took a huge amount from in terms of like improving my life and learning, but I just really remember that experience of feeling very comforted by just sitting down and reading a book in one go in this train journey. It's a book where the content didn't necessarily leave a huge impression on me, but the experience definitely did. Only a few weeks after that, I read This Is Going to Hurt by Adam Kay. I'm sure most of you know about this book by now. These are the diary entries of Adam Kay, who is a former junior doctor. His diary entries are both heartbreaking and hilarious, and I read this book the day before I went to hospital. Again, this is another one that I devoured in one sitting. It was during that remember the World Cup Love Island summer, like that one. So I really remember like what the weather was like when I was reading this book, and yeah, I just completely loved it. And then unexpectedly the next day I went to hospital, and it was possibly one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. But having just read this book, I was just so grateful for all of the NHS staff that helped me. Like, there were these people just going about their jobs, and I was like, I just read this book and I'm so grateful for your service. Are a lot of these books just associated with me being sad? Anyway, moving on. Next I have Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton. I think most young women my age have probably read this book and have connections to it in varying degrees. This is not a perfect book, I will say that, but this book put into words a lot of things that I hadn't been able to articulate before. This is Dolly Alderton's memoir that kind of like takes you through her life, and the pit stops in this book are relationships or romantic or sexual encounters she's had, but really at the heart of this book is her friendships. I read this book after I was ghosted for the very first time, and one of my friends was just like, I told her like what had happened, and she was like, just read this book, just read it. And then I did. This book taught me what the boyfriend experience was, and finding out that there's a term for that just changed my fucking life. So I just remember being sat in my bedroom reading this book, and I was like, oh shit. And I was just like, oh, this is what has just happened to me. Anyway, carrying on. Next I have Queer Intentions by Amelia Abraham. I really associate this book with going to an event for it in Gaze the Word that was organised by Book Break, and I will leave that video linked down below in the description if you haven't seen it. I think it's a really cool video. It was a really cool event where just like a bunch of queer creators hung out and Gaze the Word for a few hours, ate some stuff from Pret and chatted, and it was great. And I read this book literally on the journey there, and of course that in itself was a really like fun experience, but what I loved about this book was that it really like welcomed me into queer culture with open arms. I think as a straight passing queer woman, I've not always felt fully welcomed into like the queer community, and this book like really welcomed me with open arms, and that was lovely. And I learned so much from it about other like subsections of the queer community, so obviously that was just like a fun experience. But I don't know, like this event happened like literally like a few weeks before I had my job interviews at Pam Macmillan, who published this book, and then like subsequently got the job, and I've been there for over a year now. So like all of these different experiences are kind of bundled into my memories of this book. It's really fantastic. The paperback's out now and I would really recommend it. Next I have Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by reni-eddo Lodge. This is a book that takes a look at mainly the history of Britain, looks at a lot of the racist societal structures that are ingrained and a lot of people's racist ideas. I learned so much from this book, and I really vividly remember the experience of listening to it, and I really remember, you know, having to rewind bits because I just needed to read it, listen to it again, and just really let it sink in, and I learned so much from this book. The time and the place I particularly associate it with was when I was doing my job interviews for PanMac. and this is the audiobook that I listened to like on the journeys to the interview. When I was doing interviews for the publishing industry, I would always get like a really cheap National Express coach that left like super early in the morning, and then like another one that left really late. One, because it was cheaper than trains, and two, because I wanted to get my money's worth of spending a day in London, I guess. So I really vividly remember like wandering around London and listening to this book and really trying to take it in. If you've not read this one yet, please do. Next, I have Brutally Honest by Melanie Brown. As you may know her as Scary Spice from the Spice Girls. I love the Spice Girls so much. The time and the place I really associate this book with is when I was moving to London. In the first part of this tag, I spoke about Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams and how that was a book that I really associated with the time when I was moving to London, but the non-fiction book I was reading at the time, or in fact listening to, was Brutally Honest by Melanie Brown. And it was really interesting to be consuming these books at the same time. There had been so many things that happened in Mel B's life that I just didn't know about, and it was really interesting to hear from someone who is so famous and find out what was actually going on in her life behind closed doors, and to hear what an incredible person she is. And I just really remember like unpacking all of my stuff while listening to this book and just having to like sit down and stop. If you like the Spice Girls and you've not read this book, what are you doing? Next, I have Don't Touch My Hair by Emma Dabiri. I read this as part of the Irish Readathon back in March, and it holds a really dear place in my heart because of that. But again, like Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, I listened to this one and found myself like rewinding it so often to re-listen to portions of it to fully like understand and appreciate what the author was trying to get across. This non-fiction book is all about black hairstyles, the history of them and people's perceptions of them. It's thoroughly well researched. I've read a few similar books in the past, and I think this one in many ways goes like the extra mile with discussing these things within their historical context, and I learned so much from it. The memory that I really associate with this book is being sat at a desk in work and just like listening to it from start to finish and rewinding in between throughout the whole day. And when I was reading it, I was just telling so many people about it and just saying like, you've got to read this book is so good. So I really associate that book with that experience, and I really miss being sat in the office listening to audiobooks. And the final book I'm going to talk about is one that I read really quite recently, and that is Women Don't Owe You Pretty by Florence Given. So loads of my friends were talking about this book, and I've not actually seen that many people talking about it on BookTube, but in like my wider friendship circles, this book has been everywhere. And one of my friends who, you know, I spill all my emotions to had said to me, Leanne, you've got to read this book. So I went into a Waterstones before I was due to catch a flight to come back to Ireland and picked up this book, and I read it then, which is something that I never do, and that's why I think I will really profoundly remember this reading experience, because I'm definitely the type of person who will buy a book and it will sit on my shelves for several months or years, and I very rarely have that experience of going and buying a book and immediately reading it. So I went to the airport and I read this book, and I read it in one sitting, and my god. This is a book that is kind of about female empowerment, and it's about all different kinds of women. The illustrations in this book are stunning and really inclusive of different bodies. There were a few aspects of this book that I found kind of like, I suppose like I found with Girl Up, they were kind of like female empowerment 101, but there were also some really like difficult moments for me when I was reading this book, because there were just some life lessons in this that weren't sugar-coated, and it was about stuff that I really needed to hear. And there are definitely like so many things in this book that I underlined and that I'm gonna come back to, and there are so many lessons that I took from this book, and I just really vividly remember that reading experience and really enjoyed buying something and reading it immediately. Like, it sounds like so simple, but it's something that I never get to do through a fault of my own. So that's it. They are all the books that I'm going to talk about today. Do leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've read any of them and what you thought of them, or are there any other books that you associate with similar experiences to the ones I associate these ones with. They'll all be linked down below in the description if you want to find out more. I hope you guys are having a brilliant day, and I will talk to you in my next video.